So hello everyone and welcome to the Study of Religions Department Research Seminar. We're delighted to have Dr. Edward Kessler, who is the founder-president of the Wolf Institute and a leading thinker in interfaith relations, primarily Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations. He founded the Wolf Institute, originally called the Center for Jewish Christian Relations, in 1998 and was elected Fellow of St. Edmund's College in 2002. In 2007, Dr. Kessler was described by the Times Higher Education Supplement London as, quote, probably the most prolific interfaith figure in British academia. And in 2011 was awarded an MBE for services to interfaith relations. He has written or edited 12 books, including An Introduction to Jewish-Christian Relations, Cambridge 2010, Jews, Christians and Muslims in Encounter, SCM 2013, and Jesus, which was published by the History Press in 2016. He's presently editing a documentary, History of Jewish-Christian Relations, which will be out in Cambridge 2023. And he was convener and vice chair of the Commission on Religion and Belief in British Public Life from 2013 to 15, which published a major policy report entitled Living with Difference and principal investigator of the Wolf Diversity Study, a study of diversity in England and Wales from 2017 to 2019, which published a major policy report entitled How We Get Along. So there's much more I could say by way of introduction and the many accolades of Dr. Kessler, but I will hand you over to him to tell us about the sacrifice of Abraham's son in Judaism, Christianity and Islam. So we're delighted to have you here, Dr. Kessler.
Thanks, Jenny, and everybody, and Aman for your kind invitation. And hopefully the rabbi will manage to get on before too long. I have to say I've been impressed when I looked at the your courses in Cork, and I was so pleased to see that they're being delivered from a non-theological and non-confessional perspective. So I say mazel tov to you. Seems appropriately enough, and thanks again for being here. Now, I've been interested in the study and teaching of Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations for over 25 years. And I'm particularly interested in the shared history in terms of our scriptures and their interpretations. And it's when we look at those interpretations that we can see a sort of Abrahamic dialogue, if you like, taking place in ancient times, but also has relevance for the modern day. It's probably worth defining what's meant by dialogue, because it's so often misconstrued and ill-defined. A casual conversation that may add up to no more than a loose restatement of entrenched theological positions is not dialogue, and nor is dialogue simply communication. For dialogue to take place, there has to be a genuine hearing of the other. Now, the word itself, as you probably know, comes from the Greek logos, which can mean a way of interpreting the world. Indeed, the word in John 1:14, which became flesh in Jesus, is an English translation of logos. The other element of dialogue, dia, means through. So dia logos, or dialogue, means arguing a worldview through to a conclusion or a series of conclusions. It's not a modern concept. Now, the Abrahamic faiths and their scriptures encourage meaningful meetings, not merely courteous and neighborly ones. So when Paul of Tarsus entered the synagogue in Ephesus, he is recorded in the New Testament as arguing and pleading about the kingdom of God. And the word arguing is arguably a rather fierce translation. The Greek word is dialegemenos, which has connotations of rather more careful and courteous listening than argue carries. The point is that these were meaningful, even if provocative, conversations and not commonplace chit-chat. Now, in medieval times, dialogue continued, especially between Christians, Muslims and Jews, who shared a common intellectual history. From the philosophical dialogues between Ibn Rushd, Averroes, Moses Maimonides, medieval Spain, and without such a dialogue or encounter with the intellectual world of Islam, for example, Europe would not have rediscovered the traditions of the Greek philosophers, whose teachings were first revived by Muslim scholars such as Ibn Farabi, al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, who went on themselves to influence the ideas and writings of so many Jewish and Christian scholars, including Maimonides. An example of Maimonides, he held the position of physician to the great Sultan Salahuddin.
Or something, and I can't find it anywhere.
A future intellectual conversation and dialogue between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Now, I'm going to share my screen. This is where it all becomes slightly worrying from my point of view, but may not be yours. So I'm going to share my screen and begin to, let's see if it works. Looking hopeful. And there we go. So hopefully you can see what I can see, and we'll take it from here. Good. Okay, so we're now moving to the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, or I should say the attempted sacrifice of Abraham's son, where we uncover encounters and conversations, ancient and modern, about the willingness of somebody to give up his life for a greater cause. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam extol self-sacrifice, the virtue of which stands at the heart of each. The focus of the story is traditionally understood as Abraham's relationship with God and how his faith in and commitment to God was demonstrated by his willingness to sacrifice his long-awaited son. Now, as a piece of writing, the biblical account and the Quranic account has everything. It has tension, it has drama, it has enough action for a 5-act play, or, as you can see before you, a world-famous image. Now, in the Quran, 6 verses, but in the 18 verses of Genesis, it remains compressed, packed with energy, dynamism. It is a paradigm of Aristotle's catharsis, arousing both terror and pity, as you can see in the image, dealing with the biggest themes and touching the deepest emotions. In fact, it seems to have everything, except one, an immediately apparent and morally acceptable message. The Chagall image prompts us to ask, how could Abraham reconcile the bizarre demand by God to sacrifice his son against the divine promise that he would be an ancestor to the world, ancestor of a people who would spread throughout the world? Now, interpretations of this story demonstrate the extent to which Jews, Christians, and Muslims share an exegetical tradition. And I suggest that neither Jewish, Christian, nor Muslim interpretations can be understood fully in reference to the other. This has enormous significance for the historical and contemporary Abrahamic encounter. You see, Abraham's attempted sacrifice of his son has been important for the children of Abraham, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, from a very early period. For Jews, from at least as early as the 3rd century CE, the passage known as the Akedah, or binding of Isaac, has been read on Rosh ha-Shana, the Jewish New Year. For Christians from the same period, the sacrifice of Isaac was mentioned in the Eucharist prayers, and the story is read in the period leading up to Easter. And for Muslims, the festival of al-Adha commemorates Ibrahim's willingness to sacrifice his son at God's command. Interpretations of this narrative provide an insight into the Abrahamic encounter because, and this is key to my argument, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived and continue to live in a scripturally orientated culture. Similarities include an insistence on the harmony of scripture, an emphasis on the unity of the text. Consequently, interpretations are understandable to the adherents of more than one religion. And this is why Christian exegetes such as Origen and Jerome turn to Jewish contemporaries for help in translating biblical texts. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim commentators are close readers of the text. They're interested in its detail. Obviously, they develop their own interpretations, distinctive approaches, but that wouldn't have prevented the communities from understanding these interpretations. You can see here in this quote from Origen, a 3rd century church father based in Antioch. And he says, you see, observe each detail of scripture which has been written, for if one knows how to dig into the depths, he will find treasure in the details. He could have been speaking for rabbis. He could have been speaking for Muslim commentators as well. For Muslims, the most reliable commentary is, of course, in the Quran itself. And tafsiri, the word for commentary, begins on this principle. Like the Rabbinic interpretation, scripture explains scripture. For Muslim commentators, the ways in which one verse or one passage clarifies another is the most significant form of commentary. The word tafsir is derived from the root fasara, to explain or expound, and refers to an interpretation of the scriptural text. Its approach is frankly similar to midrash, a Hebrew term for searching, inquiring, and interpreting, which you would notice is familiar to some patristic interpretations of scripture. And as you can see, a very brief summary of comparing different hermeneutical traditions in the three Abrahamic faiths. The emergence of Christianity out of Judaism, the advent of Islam in the Middle East, and the closeness of the scriptural texts create a platform upon which we can listen, if you like, to these ancient conversations and start new ones. Now, we haven't got time to read the whole passage, but I'm going to select a couple of verses. And the first one is the beginning of Genesis 22. Let me read the Hebrew to you, for those who don't know Hebrew, and translate it word for word. And after these things, Elohim nisa et Abraham, and God tested Abraham, and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Hineni, here I am. And he said, Kachna, please take, et bincha, your son, et yachidacha, your only son, asher ahavta, whom you love, et Yitzhak, Isaac. V'lech lecha el eretz ha-Moriah, and go up to the land of Moriah, v'ha'alehu sham la'olah, and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering, al-Adha heharim, on one of the mountains which I asher omar elecha, which I will tell you. Now, to illustrate the context of the exegetical encounter on these verses, I'll start with the church fathers and the rabbis, who shared, of course, the same text. But interestingly, they asked the same questions and sometimes even offered the same answers. For example, they were both keen to respond to the charge that God desired human sacrifice. And they both said the purpose of the test was to exalt Abraham. They were interested in God's choice of words. Your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. They asked the same question. Why did God not simply say Isaac? And they came to the same conclusion. The purpose of the drawn out description was to increase Abraham's affection for his son, to increase the severity of the test. They even created a dialogue between Abraham and God. And this is from Gregory of Nyssa, 4th century church father, who constructed a conversation between Abraham and God. You can see it in front of you, I won't read it. That Abraham, an imaginary conversation, if you like, that Abraham didn't have with God. So Gregory used the hermeneutic, if you like, of a dialogue. And he created this dialogue. Now, if we look at the rabbis, I'm going to jump to the Rabbinic interpretation. This is the Midrash. The rabbis also created the dialogue, an element of theatre, if you like. But in this case, it was a real interpretation. God said to Abraham, which son? And eventually God makes it clear which son it is. It's Isaac. So the point is, I really want to start off by saying, look, it's not just the same text that Jews and Christians share. They ask the same questions, and they sometimes come out with the same answers, and they certainly use the same techniques. But this is an interesting question about who are we talking about? Which son? And this is what the Quran raises. Here's the text from the Quran, the same story, but portrayed in a different way. Unlike the Bible, you'll see, the Quran does not identify the son. Excuse me. Does not identify the son, although most Muslims today, and I'm sure Muslims who are listening to this presentation, tend to identify him with Ishmael. Yet interestingly, some of the early commentators name Isaac as the son chosen for sacrifice. For example, al-Tabari, a Persian commentator from the late 9th century, makes it clear who the son is. And if you take a moment to read that passage while I have a swig of water, you'll see that he identifies that unnamed son in the Quran with Isaac. Yet a few centuries later, the main tradition in Islam had changed. And here is a quote from Ismail ibn Kathir from the 14th century, from Syria, who produced a commentary which is one of the most widely, probably the most widely accepted commentary, and identifies the son as Ishmael, and that remains the main view today. And there have been some discussions about the different commentators and the divergence of opinion, and it seems that the argument between the two rests on the commentator's view of the location of the sacrifice. If the sacrifice took place in Jerusalem, if you've ever been up to al-Aqsa, on that dome for Jews, the Temple Mount or Mount Moriah, if that's the location of the sacrifice, it's deemed as Isaac. But if it took place in Mecca, then it's deemed to be Ishmael. But let's move on. Here's a couple of verses from the middle of Genesis 22, and I'll just take a moment to read again in Hebrew and translate for you. Vayikach Avraham et atzei ha'olah. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, vayasem al Yitzhak bano, and he placed it on Isaac his son, vayikach biado, and he took in his hand et ha'esh, the fire, ve'et ha'ma'achelet, and the knife, v'yalchu shnechem yachdav, and the two of them went off together. V'yameh Yitzhak el Avraham aviv, and Isaac said to Abraham his father, v'yameh Abi, and he said to him, Daddy. V'yomeh, and he said, Hineni bani, here I am, my son. V'yomeh, and he said, Hine ha'esh, here is the fire, v'ha'etzim, and the wood, v'ayeh haseh lo'olah. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering? V'yomeh Avraham, and Abraham said, Elohim yireh lo haseh lo'olah. God will cause to be seen. It's the hifil, the causative of to see, or the English is provide, but literally cause to be seen. Haseh lo'olah, the lamb for the burnt offering. Bani, my son, v'yachu shnechem yachdav, and the two of them went off together. Now, there are two strands of thought in Christian interpretation of this text. In the first, Isaac is deemed as a child, and in the second, a young man who's not yet fulfilled or reached adulthood. According to the 4th century church father, Cyril of Alexandria, Isaac was one who was small and lying in the breast of his own father, while John Chrysostom from Antioch, in the also late 4th century, suggests he was slightly more mature, that Isaac, and I'm quoting now, had come of age and was in fact in the very bloom of youth. So for the church fathers, Isaac was a child or a very young man. For the rabbis, the position was significantly different. The rabbis stated that Isaac was either 37 or 26 or 36. Of course, in good typical Jewish way, there are lots of different interpretations. The point is, unlike the biblical text, the rabbis consistently portrayed Isaac as an adult. I'll discuss the reasons why in a moment. But first, the significance of Isaac carrying the wood. Unsurprisingly, and this is a passage or a fragment from Melito Sardis, 2nd century church father from Asia Minor, there is a link between, of course, Isaac carrying the wood and Christ carrying the cross. For Melito, there are parallels between Isaac and Jesus. Isaac was the model of Christ. They were both bound. They were both led to the sacrifice by their father, and neither was sorrowful. In other words, for the church fathers, Isaac becomes a model of the sacrifice that is yet to come, that the sacrifice could not take place. It was a typological approach and provides not only parallels between Isaac and Christ, but contrasts, because Isaac wasn't sacrificed. He prefigured the future sacrifice. It was important, in fact, that Isaac wasn't sacrificed, that Isaac did not suffer. He was simply the model waiting to be fulfilled, the child waiting to grow into the man. Now, the rabbis, of course, also commented on Isaac carrying the wood, and this is what they said. Now, Genesis Rabbah is a very important midrash from the 6th century in Palestine, and there it says that Isaac carried the wood like a man carrying a cross. The Hebrew is tuluv. So this rabbinic interpretation demonstrates an exegetical encounter, because the Christian interpretation has been appropriated, modified, and is as near an explicit reference to Christianity as you find in rabbinic literature. But there's more. By depicting Isaac as an adult, they wanted to emphasize his willingness to be sacrificed, to suffer, to offer himself to his father. Isaac was not forced, as you can see in the passage below from Lamentations Rabbah, another classic midrash from the 6th, 7th century, gave himself to Abraham. He is speaking, as you can see there, to God, and he raised no objection to be sacrificed. Such was his willingness to give up his life, that it appears that this is a rabbinic response to the Christian teaching that Christ was willing to give up his life. Indeed, Isaac was informed in advance of the sacrifice and continued the journey with Abraham, one to bind, one to be bound, one to slaughter, one to be slaughtered. And that's why for Jews, the story is known as the Akedah Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac, rather than the test of Abraham. In the rabbinic view, so willing was Isaac to give up his life that they describe the narrative in terms of the blood of the binding of Isaac, or the ashes of Isaac. And this is so startling because the biblical account explicitly states, as you probably know, that the angel stopped Abraham from harming his son. And there you have a passage from the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael about it's a bit of an argument about the dating, but probably about the 8th century, which talks about the blood of the binding of Isaac. So, does this imply that Isaac was actually sacrificed? Did he actually die? Surely not. But yes, here we have a midrash from the 8th century, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which says that Isaac actually died. When the sword touched his neck, the soul of Isaac took flight and departed, and then returned to the body of Isaac. It is Isaac indeed who is associated with the resurrection of the dead, the second blessing of the Amidah. So the argument I put before you is that the death and resurrection of Isaac in rabbinic interpretations is a response directly to Christianity. But I'd like now to pass on to interpretations that involve Islam. And there is a remarkable similarity you don't find in Christian interpretations of the appearance of Satan. So here is an example from Tanhuma, which I gave you a little passage earlier, when Satan actually visited Sarah and pretending to be Isaac. And such was her shock when Isaac, or Satan, told Sarah what happened, that she fainted and died. And at the beginning of chapter 23 of Genesis, and the sacrifice of Isaac, or the Akedah, is in chapter 22. The beginning of chapter 23 is the death of Sarah, the Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah, but it recounts her death. So there we have in the rabbinic writings the appearance of Satan. It doesn't appear in the Bible, that's for sure. Now, what's so interesting is, why does Satan appear? Perhaps it's a way of separating God from this challenge and blaming Satan. Maybe it's a way, in this way, to increase the interpretation to change the interpretation of the test, to increase the severity, if you like, on Abraham and Sarah. Each was equal to the challenge. But there are also Muslim interpretations of Satan appearing, attempting to divert Abraham and Isaac and Sarah from the sacrifice of their son. In the Islamic interpretation from the 7th century, obedience to God prevails. The early commentator, his name is al-Akbar, yes, Kalb al-Akbar, 7th century, who was a Jewish convert to Islam, which may have been the conduit of this interpretation. Satan appeared to Sarah, identifying the son as Isaac. He asked where Abraham and Isaac went. She replied they went to do an errand or gather firewood. Satan informed her that Abraham intended to sacrifice Isaac. Sarah responds that Abraham would never do that, but asks why he would even wish to consider it. Satan answers that Abraham claimed God commanded him to do that. Sarah replies, if God commanded that of him, then he should do it. Satan then appears to Isaac and receives the same reply. And what you have in front of you from that quote is when he goes to Abraham. And this interpretation was included by other Muslim commentators, including al-Talabi. So that's an example, if you like, of a Jewish-Muslim encounter. So I'd like to just say a few words before I finish on the implications of the exegetical encounter. So let me just escape out of the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that. And then just say, as I say, a few words about the implications of the exegetical encounter, of which I've only been able to show you a smattering. So even though Jewish, Christian and Muslim commentators of the sacrifice of Abraham's son are put to different use, I hope I've shown how some illustrate this mutual awareness, the echoes of which you have heard today. In other words, the children of Abraham, Jews, Christians and Muslims, possess exegetical traditions which were open to each other's interpretations. And the significance is magnified by our scriptures and their interpretations not being history, what happened sometime else to someone else, but memory, what happened to our ancestors, and therefore, insofar as we carry on their story, to us. The scriptures speak of moral truths, not in the abstract, but of commands addressed to us, calling for our response, requiring our interpretation, necessitating an understanding of our common exegetical tradition. Now, sometimes my philosophical and scientific-minded Cambridge colleagues and friends tease me, saying that they seek the answers to the big questions. What is knowledge? What is truth? What is really there? They tell me that a statement and its opposite cannot both be true. Either there is or there is not a table in this room. Either Napoleon was or was not forced to retreat from Moscow. Either the universe did or did not have a beginning in time. Now, this works well for facts and descriptions, but it doesn't work well for what Viktor Frankl called humanity's search for meaning. You see, the argument is that meaning is not to be found in scientific facts, pure reason or physical description. And even Richard Dawkins notes at the end of The Selfish Gene that scientific facts entail nothing about how we should or should not act. We alone, he wrote, can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. In other words, meaning is not found in systems, but in stories, not in nature, but in narrative. The stories we tell about ourselves, about who we are, where we came from, what is our place, and what we are called to do. And that's why Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scriptures are our example, supreme example of a search for meaning, often written in the form of a narrative. For unlike philosophy, narratives celebrate the concrete, not the abstract, the particular, not the universal, the open future made by human choice, not the closed, predictable future of scientific laws and historical inevitability. Narrative does not exist in the opposition between the objective and the subjective, but in the in between, what you might call the intersubjective. Narrative truth is not like scientific or logical truth. It does not obey the law of the excluded middle. It does not operate on the either true or false anality, the either or of truth and falsity. Narratives contain multiple points of view. They are open, essentially, not accidentally, to more than one interpretation, to more than one level of interpretation. And nor does the validity of one story exclude the other. Stories, such as our historical narratives, do more than reflect facts about the world. They offer interpretations of the world. They attempt to make sense out of the raw data of events. They create worlds. They do not merely describe them. And what is true of texts is true of relationships. And this is where we get to the Jewish, Christian, Muslim encounter. Because relationships are multifaceted in a way that physical facts are not. I'm either slightly grey-haired, short-sighted and bespectacled, but I am simultaneously a child of my parents, the father of my children, the husband of my wife. I have colleagues, friends, neighbours and co-religionists. I'm a citizen of England, the United Kingdom and Europe, as well as belonging to humanity as a whole. And the point is, each of these relationships is covenantal in the sense that it involves reciprocal obligations. These obligations can conflict. Should I accept a speaking invitation or spend the evening with my wife and children? I'm torn between my responsibilities as someone engaged in interfaith dialogue and study and my duties as a father and husband. But the point is, there's no principled incompatibility between these loyalties. In other words, the truth of one does not entail the falsity of others. Objective facts about a person are one thing, the relationships that make each of us who we are another. Here, there is no either or. Instead, there is a series of narratives. Those we tell about ourselves and others tell about us. Multiple narratives do not exclude the other. To the contrary, they build up a composite picture, a common tradition. They are part of what makes us human, hence different, hence unsubstitutable, which is why Muslims and Jews have the saying, a single life is like a universe. Hence, the profound difference between thinking if my faith is true and conflicts with yours, then yours is false. If I and my fellow believers have a relationship with God, that does not entail you do not. I have my stories, my rituals, my memories, my prayers, my celebrations, laws and customs, and you have yours. That's what makes me, me, and well, you. It's what differentiates cultures, heritages, and civilizations. The truth of one does not entail the falsity of the other. In fact, the very word true and false seems out of place here, as if we were using words from one domain to describe phenomena belonging to another. Our interpretations, our language, our encounters speak not of brute facts, but of exegetical ones, not of physical descriptions, but of systems of meaning, modes of belonging, ways in which groups relate to themselves, to the universe, and one another. So I suggest to you that the exegetical encounters of former days have seeded a field that harvests a common tradition, the essential precondition of flourishing interfaith relationships and cooperative behavior. The scientific question is, what can I know about the world? The religious question is, how shall I act and expect others to act if we are to achieve together what none of us can do alone? The former generates narratives of displacement. Truth cannot coexist with falsehood. If I'm convinced that I possess the truth while you're sunk in error, I may try to persuade you. But if you refuse to be persuaded, I may conquer or convert you, imposing my view by force in the name of truth. And this thinking, frankly, leads to the mindset of I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell. Interpretations of the Abrahamic scriptures, however, with the acknowledgement of the multiplicity of narratives, relationships, interpretations, cultures, and covenants, are fundamentally opposed to displacement narratives. The encounter subverts them by offering counter-narratives in their place. The message of these exegetical encounters is that despite our differences, we each have integrity and dignity in the mind of God. We are reminded, and this is a point of immense significance, that beyond the truths that define the human situation as such, all further relationships between God and humanity are covenantal. None excludes others. God may be with us, but also with those who are not like us, with friends, but also with strangers. Which is why the Torah tells us on 36 separate occasions to love the stranger and only once to love the neighbor. Interpretations of the sacrifice of Abraham's son, I suggest, reminds us of a common narrative, a covenant, a sense of meaning and purpose in history, and the concepts of human freedom, responsibility, and dignity. Greece, not to mention Oxford and Cambridge, may have produced philosophers, but the Abrahamic faiths, prophets. Greece gave us tragedy. The Middle East, its opposite, hope. If this is difficult, and I now draw to a close, which it is, it can be said another way. My wife Tricia and I have 3 children. We love them equally and unconditionally. They are very different from one another. They have different strengths, skills, interests, temperaments, and emotional needs. And if we favoured one at the cost of the others, we would have failed as parents. Still more would we have failed if, having loved our firstborn, we then withdrew that affection on the birth of our subsequent children, transferring it each time to the youngest. Such behaviour would have damaged them all deeply, creating rivalries, insecurities, and a sense of rejection. And if that's true of human parents, how much more so of the divine? Can I really believe that God, having set his love on and made a covenant with the children of Israel, then rejected them when they continued to honour that covenant, choosing not to follow the new faith, Christianity? Can I believe that the God of love, in loving Christians, thereby abandoned Jews? Can I make sense of the idea that 6 centuries after the birth of Christianity and 26 after the journey of Abraham, God revealed that Jews and Christians had been mistaken all along, that Islam replaced them and their religious destiny was other than they had believed it to be? Now, I can perfectly well understand that first Ptolemy, then Copernicus, then Newton, perhaps even Einstein, were shown to be wrong in their scientific beliefs, and that if a religion is like a science, yes, it is open to such refutations. But to think of religion as a science is to think that God is a concept. But Scripture and our stories remind us that God is a parent. The story of the sacrifice of Abraham's son and the accompanying Abrahamic interpretations invite us to reflect not on a concept, but on a relationship, to engage not in a theoretical exercise, but in a dialogue. And it's not too bold to suggest that the exegetical encounters which took place so long ago point the way forward today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kessler. I will open the floor now for questions or comments. You can either put up your hand using the function on your one that says reactions on your toolbar, or you can type in the chat. So James Cronin.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Dr. Kessler. That really interesting talk. I want to tease apart maybe a little bit the notion of dialogue. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of the image from Genesis of Jacob wrestling the angel and his name being transformed to Israel, he who contends or wrestles with God. And I'm just wondering, I'd like to hear your insight on whether or not these kind of patterns of narrative in the Old Testament are linked to maybe the ways in which the people of the book are meant to contend or wrestle with God. In other words, that dialogue is very muted and maybe flattened in contemporary society, and that maybe the older tradition is more about wrestling and contending with meaning, and therefore creating real debate. Thank you.
Thanks, James. It's a good question. I think that whole question of struggling with God is very much at the heart of Jewish interpretation, both in ancient times and today. Now, in Islam, I think it's fair to say that the idea of wrestling with God is not considered a positive thing. Wrestling with texts, yes, but not with the Almighty. Whereas in Judaism, it is part of the challenge of understanding a text. Now, in Christianity, I'm thinking about, consider the church fathers and the sort of the classical traditions. It's closer to the Islamic view, I think, than the Jewish view. And you're quite right, James, to say that the name Israel is about struggling with God. So at the very, from those times, it's been part of the identity. In more recent times, of course, you think of Kierkegaard and some of the modern philosophers, theologians, commentators. There is much more of a struggle, and certainly post Shoah theologians who are grappling with theodicy and the problem of evil in modern times also grapple with yes, even the existence and the place, the role of God. Is God hidden away, for example, the concept of being eclipsed that Martin Buber and others talked about, but also some Christian theologians. So I think personally, I think it's quite a helpful thing. And I think one of the modern interpretations of the Akedah I've quite liked is that the reason that in some ways Abraham failed the test, that God was waiting for Abraham to say, no, I'm not going to do this. But because Abraham never said that, God realized at that point that he wasn't ready to reject the concept of sacrifice. So you had the sacrifice of animals and temple worship, but that God actually, yes, that Abraham, maybe it's a postmodern interpretation, James, but Abraham actually failed the test. But yes, struggling with God can be found commonplace in Judaism, not so in Islam, a little bit in Christianity.
Thank you.
Amina? I think your internet might be frozen, Amina.
Nope.
Oh no, I can hear you now.
Sorry, my connection is not very stable. Yeah, I was just saying thank you for the talk, but yeah, and I think I do agree with you on the point that I think in the Islamic tradition the wrestling with God is perhaps not as much of an issue as in the other traditions. But I think in the Sufi tradition it's quite interesting, because I think Ibn al-Arabi's reading of the Abrahamic story is quite an interesting one, and he posits that the test for Abraham wasn't a test of his faith, but really of his knowledge and as a mystic and his interpretation really of the dream that he had. And he posits perhaps that he did misunderstand what was meant by the dream in the sense that he took it perhaps more literally than it was meant to be. So that's an interesting one, and I think it allows for the expansion to the understanding that God's will needs to be interpreted, and that no one can claim interpretive infallibility, so to speak. And I think what's really interesting is also this idea that for Gnostics or mystics, almost that Abraham, it was almost more of a sacrifice of his saintliness or his that station that he'd achieved in order to descend to more of a level of humanity, in order to I guess expound the faith and so on. So I think in the Islamic tradition perhaps there is maybe more of a sense that there are certain tests that prophets go through that are very specific to them in their nature. And that is a very particular dialogue that they have with the divine. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but my second question, if I can, is also, I've been quite fascinated by the depiction in art and painting of the Abrahamic story, and I've noticed that particularly in the Christian art that I've looked at, it can be quite brutal and it's almost quite violent. And from some of the Islamic art that I've seen, there's a much gentler, almost compassionate sense to it. I noticed that they often depict Ismail or Isaac as blindfolded, and Abraham standing behind him, and so on. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how it's been depicted in sort of the artistic tradition.
Thank you, Amina. And I think it's good point about the Sufi and the mystical tradition, because some ways the mystics have far more in common across the faith than they do with their co-religionists at times. But that's actually helpful. And of course, within the different techniques, the different hermeneutical traditions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, there's not just the literal interpretation. There are multiple levels of interpretation, which allows for that variety. As far as the art, it's fascinating. I haven't looked into Islamic art, and I'd love to know more about that. I do have, I haven't got really time this time, but I do have a whole range of different figurative representations of the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, in early Christian art, pre-Islamic Christian art, it's much more primitive, and it's not brutal, it's more primitive. Whereas in the sort of art that you're thinking of, and sort of you know, the Enlightenment, the Reformation, and post-Enlightenment traditions and so on, yes, you know, the drama of the occasion is you know, so striking and painful to look at, isn't it? So you're quite right. In the Jewish art, interestingly, Jewish artists seem to have been influenced by the Christian artists. So there are images that make Isaac very Christian. But so you, and again, it shouldn't surprise us. A bit like I said with the mystics having quite a lot in common. So do the artists. You know, now whether Christian artists actually were responsible for some of the mosaics in synagogues, we don't know. Certainly they had Greek names, for example, but of course Jews might have had Greek names as well. But there is this encounter on the level of the artist, and there is, if you like, an artistic exegesis, which is sometimes different from the literary exegesis. I think it's Gregory of Nyssa, one of the church fathers, talk about how art leads the story. And so I think that's quite a nice expression, art leading the story, that we always think of the story itself as leading everything else, but actually there are times when the artistic representation sheds light on the written narrative in a way that we always assume it's the other way. But thank you very much.
Any more questions or comments? James?
Hello, thank you very much for that really fascinating paper, and I really appreciated the emphasis there on narrative, yeah, I was thinking about that, pushing that a little further. My own research field is Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and there are sort of living ritual traditions and performative traditions that involve the story of Abraham and Isaac, and some of those are shared across Muslim, Christian, and perhaps Jewish communities as well, but I haven't really encountered those. So I was just thinking about the relationship between narrative and performance, and perhaps in a similar way to the idea around art, the way that kind of art could drive a story, the way performance actually drives the story, and can be the ground on which this kind of exchange and crossover takes place. So I just wondered about your thoughts on that, on the role of ritual and performativity in the story of Abraham and Isaac or Ishmael.
Thank you, James. That's a really interesting question. I haven't done much work on the performative aspect of the story. Obviously, its appearance in literature, and I know it's not quite, but you think about it in poetry, in the arts, Wilfred Owen, for example, the parable of the old man and the young, in Bob Dylan, was it Route 66? In Israeli literature, actually, quite a lot of imagery appears in modern Hebrew literature and poetry about the story because it's so powerful. But in terms of actual performance, the answer is I don't know, and that's something for me to look into. But I would say in other areas of performance, so for example, the Passion plays or Purim spiels, which are very much part of the tradition, and I don't know about where it plays in Islam, but certainly in those narratives, they're incredibly powerful. And part of the reason they're powerful is whether people, certainly on the Christian Passion plays, would not necessarily have read, right? Would not be able to read. So it's the actual performance that's as powerful. So going to a church and an Orthodox service, as you know, if you've done some work in Eastern Europe, could be a good 3 hours long. So what do? You kind of look around you and you see the artistic representations on the wall of, say, Christ's suffering or the Stations of the Cross or whatever it is. So these narratives, these performative narratives, are very important. when I was a religion school teacher, when my kids were very young, I got them to perform the sacrifice of Isaac, and they had a great deal of fun doing it. But I don't know of other performances. There are plenty of performances about the trial of God, and going back to the other James's question about the wrestling with God, Elie Wiesel's The Trial, for example. But I don't know about the sacrifice of Abraham's son or the sacrifice of Isaac. But you are right to say that performative narratives is another, like the artistic narratives, that has its own exegetical encounter, this own interpretation. And in some ways, it's not black and white, like a text. I can wear color, I can perform, I can sing. So it's no surprise that and because it's such a powerful story and powerful narrative, that it's very much taken hold since Kierkegaard in modern times.
No, thanks for that. I mean, I was thinking of, in the Balkans, it's amongst Balkan Christian communities, it's quite common to sing the story of Abraham and Isaac at the time of what's also called a Korban festival, when on the feast day of St. George, for example, and St. Dimitri. So there's a crossover there between sort of the kind of lives of Christian saints and the Old Testament narrative. But I was also thinking about there is a thesis, of course, that the Islamic narrative comes from having heard, performed, perhaps told as stories, the Jewish traditions from both learned and unlearned storytellers. And again, in the Christian tradition as well, having been the product of storytelling across religious communities, rather than the simply a textual adoption. It's actually performance gave birth to the adoption and the interchange, and not simply from Judaism across to Islam, but from Islam back to Christianity and back to Judaism. And I think
the fluidity of it,
of it, yeah, exactly. And so which is why I really appreciated the point you made there about narrative not being about truth and not truth, and performance adds an extra layer to that. It's like, okay, the power of the performance and the drive, if you like, to assimilate into newer performances the kind of the different elements that have come from the different traditions, drives the tradition on in new ways, with new levels of creativity, without compromising canonical texts, but taking canonical texts into a whole different kind of realm of encounter, if you like, where there isn't so much the need or the drive for a kind of doctrinal or sort of interpretational sort of canonical position on the text. There's an experiential encounter with it where those things matter less, and can be appreciated for the kind of the emotional and sensorial and experiential kind of dimension of the text. Yeah.
Thank you.
So thanks again. Yeah.
So it's 5 o'clock, so I don't want to keep you too long, Dr. Kessler, unless anyone has a burning question. So thank you very much for your presentation. Just stop the recording there.